So welcome to tonight's session of the Material World series, which I will be chairing. Unfortunately, my co-chair, Louisa, is unable to come today, but I'll do the honors all on my own. And we have a novelty today, because for the first time we actually have a student from the Warburg, former student, just completed her PhD, speaking, and that's Jennifer Taylor, who has done a PhD thesis at the Warburg about Charles Perrault, and that is also the topic about which she is going to speak tonight. We'll do the usual thing. Jennifer will give her presentation, after which we'll have a Q&A, and I'll explain the rules of the Q&A when we get to that point. For now, I'll hand over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. Welcome to this evening's lecture, A Fairy Tale Defense of Women, the Iconography of Charles Perrault. I want to first thank Rembrandt Doubts, Deputy Curator of the Warburg Photographic Collection, John Millington and Louisa McKenzie for this amazing opportunity to present some of my work. Sorry. So tonight I will introduce the iconography of Charles Perrault, who is best known as the author of fairy tales. We will look at how he employed visual imagery to discuss women's worth and their roles in public and private life. I will do this through 3 of his projects: a manuscript, an interior, and a garden. To introduce the subject, we need to cover some key terms: our critical approach, the art form Perrault engaged with, and the overarching vision that unites his themes. I will use the key term sex to refer to biological categories of male and female, and I will use the key term gender to refer to a culturally conditioned performance. Masculinity and femininity will refer to gender. I'm deliberately referencing Judith Butler's usage of these terms because it is consistent with how people in 17th century France understood their social selves. Honnêteté was a refined and honorable way of behaving before others in social contexts that had masculine and feminine variations. Butler would argue that gender is not necessarily tied to biological sex, and this is where her thought differs from that of the past. In this period, the structure of thought was mapped according to duality, going back as far as Pythagoras and then Aristotle. People would have assumed that their biological sex was part of the duality that made up the fabric of the universe, and that was evident everywhere in the material world. Another key term we need to keep in mind is androgyny. The term androgyne meant a combined male-female human figure that was often allegorical. Sometimes such a figure was called by the related term hermaphrodite. Though interchangeable, at worst, the word hermaphrodite could connote effeminacy and perversion, but at best, an androgyne could point to a spiritual mystery. Indeed, this is the distinction that Marion Rothstein makes in her recent work, The Androgyne in Early Modern France. According to Rothstein, an androgyne image in visual art and literature was a figure that expressed spiritual completeness, just as God contained all male and female potentialities within himself. At the most positive extreme, male-female figures could be an image of perfection, a figure of ultimate human possibilities and strength. Composite male-female imagery had precedent in France's elite visual culture. For example, in a miniature owned by Anne-Claude Philippe de Lévis, Comte de Caylus, a bearded Francis I stands in contrapposto with a helmet on his head, a sword raised in his right hand, and a caduceus supported in the other. Aside from his arms, which are those of a man, from the neck down, Francis has the body of a woman. Apart from the bearded face, the image could easily be taken for a depiction of the goddess Minerva. As Edgar Wind observes, quote, among French humanists of the 16th century, the androgyne became so acceptable an image for the universal man that a painter could apply it without impropriety to an allegorical portrait of Francis I. At the time that Perrault was working to create allegorical images and iconographic programs for Louis XIV in the 1600s, Minerva was still being used to depict a man-woman androgynous archetype. For example, this portrait of Colbert includes a Minerva figure whose body type and clothing blend male and female traits. Notice also the mixed sex activity implied by the helmet and shield in combination with the needle for tapestry making. Moreover, this is the only allegorical figure included to complement the portrait of a male minister of state who had authority, like Minerva, over the arts of both peace and war. Instead of being dressed as Minerva, like Francis I, the scope of Colbert's political authority over the arts is symbolized by an androgynous depiction of the goddess. Minerva also appears in Charles Perrault's Cabinet de Beaux-Arts, but her image is more recognizably that of a woman warrior or virago. Her counterpart is Mercury, the messenger god, who is male. Together, they represent two complementary skills that a successful artist needs: a voice to advertise his work, Mercury, and a skilled hand guided by excellent critical judgment, Minerva. In Le Cabinet, this pair represents a figurative androgyny. The argument made by this imagery is that a male and female coded quality must coexist in the same artist, no matter that person's physical sex. So next, I want to introduce my own approach to Perrault's iconography. Understanding Perrault's thought requires an investigation that reaches across disciplines. My approach is most aligned with that of Marc Fumaroli and Irvin Levins. It involves reintegrating form and content, style and iconography, with the aim of understanding the meaning of discourse. Images are a part of that discourse and they interact with the written word. When I comment upon Perrault's work, I will be concerned primarily with its themes rather than its reception. I study the meaning that emerges from the interaction of word and image, and sometimes that of word, image, and physical space. Charles Perrault is widely recognized as a writer of fairy tales, a member of the Académie Française, and a civil servant for the king's buildings under the reign of Louis XIV. He was also a designer, skilled in developing themes through the interplay of word and image, and who combined various art disciplines to explore art, metaphysics, human nature, politics, and gender roles. So, why isn't he known as a designer or an iconographer? One reason that Perrault's creative activities have remained hidden is because a large collection of the designs that he and his brother Claude made for architectural projects was destroyed when the Bibliothèque du Louvre burned in 1871. Another reason is because his treatise, the Discours sur l'art des devises, was only recently discovered and had remained hidden for nearly 600 years. Perrault states in his memoirs that one of his main creative exercises was engaging with the art of the device. This art form is comprised of an allegorical image accompanied by a short poetic inscription, and you can see an example that Perrault composed right here. Today, we most often see devices on the backs of coins, but in the past, they were an art form prized and studied by humanists. The device could stand on its own as a work of art, but it was always related to another physical entity. For example, if the device appeared on a coin, its meaning was related to the person whose profile appeared on the obverse. The profile accurately represented the exterior of the person, and the device on the reverse expressed a truth about the person's interior hidden character. At the time, a device was a type of personal portrait, and its meaning was always dependent upon the interplay of word and image. Its designers had to have facility in creating a strong metaphorical link between the two. Perrault's rose device for Louis XIV was a part of expressing the way that the king imaged God to his people by embodying the full potentiality of masculine and feminine. This tapestry is a part of the original material context for the device we saw on the last slide. Perrault made devices as a part of an elite group of erudite men called the Petite Académie. An important early project for this group was influencing the iconography of the Elements and Seasons tapestry series. The series was produced at the Gobelin under the direction of Charles Lebrun, and it represented Louis XIV as an ideal monarch. Each of the elements and seasons reflected qualities of ideal kingship, and each of the tapestries included 4 devices, 1 for each corner. The element series was based upon the 4 classical elements of earth, air, fire, and water. Perrault created all 16 devices for these tapestries. Each of them celebrated qualities of Louis XIV as if through an elemental lens. And in this example, this is a tapestry representing Louis through the element of earth. Devices in each of the corners celebrated respectively Louis's goodness, valor, magnanimity, and piety. The devices for each tapestry had the same 4 themes. The difference was that the image and inscription changed to reflect the element. So here are the 4 devices for the quality of goodness across all 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, respectively. Since the elements were traditionally coded by sex, with earth and water being the female elements and air and fire the male, the program for the tapestries suggests androgyny because altogether they represent the nature of one human being who combines all the qualities of the masculine and feminine elements within himself. It is a picture of perfection or completeness. Here is another way a device could be used. This device appeared at the top of the dedication letter in the illuminated manuscript version of Perrault's fairy tales. The red rose with thorns, surrounded by an inscription in French and Latin, is the allegorical portrait of Elizabeth Charlotte d'Orléans, the niece of Louis XIV. She's pictured on the right. She was 19 years old when the manuscript was prepared as a gift for her, and we will talk more about this device near the end of the lecture. So, what was Perrault's vision, and how did he use devices to express it? Perrault's skill in relating image and word for the art of the device transferred easily into the designing of grand iconographic programs for interiors and gardens. His masterpiece is a program for the ceiling in his own home. This detail is from one of the allegorical paintings, and you can see a device being painted in the center. It contains the image of an ornamental garden nourished by the sun, and the inscription means, "I make everything flourish." The sun represents the Sun King, and the garden represents the best of France, the arts and sciences brought to perfection under the king's wise rule. The arts have an important function in this ecosystem. They are not raw and uncultivated nature. They are not ideal nature that only exists in the metaphysical world of eternal forms. They are something that Perrault called la belle nature. They are raw material that has been refined so it can point towards the eternal world. They are therefore a place where physical and metaphysical can meet. In Le Cabinet, the book where this is found, this device serves as a key to the meaning of the 3-dimensional space. So our first questions are going to be, how do women fit into this ideal kingdom? How does Perrault use iconography to make his arguments? And the first place we're going to look is his masterpiece, the interior direction of his own cabinet. Le Cabinet de Beaux-Arts is a complex interplay of word and image. In order to appreciate it, we need to first experience it as a piece of interior architecture. The engraved guidebook invites us to enter a 3-dimensional space, a room in a private residence. An engraving of a symbolic doorway follows the title page. Statues representing genius and hard work flank the opening to represent the 2 qualities needed to produce the fine arts. Right now, we need to imagine we are entering the room. Notice the stem of a telescope on the right. As we enter the cabinet, we pick up this instrument and we use it to view the allegorical program on the ceiling. This is an image of the ceiling itself as it would appear from below. The ceiling expands the device of the garden nourished by the sun. In the center is a painting of Apollo, the sun god, symbolic of Louis the Sun King. On the perimeter are allegories of the fine arts who are given life by the sun. In the top row center is eloquence, who governs poetry and music on either side. On the bottom row, architecture is central and rules painting and sculpture. These are divine languages that emanate from Apollo and the Muses, and that gifted human beings can learn and so communicate with the gods. Standing in this space puts us in the company of other people who would have been guests in this room. Major artists, members of the Académie Française, high-ranking politicians, court musicians, gifted poets and playwrights, architects, and Perrault himself. In short, we are the flowers of France who are inspired by these divine nymphs. And as the fine arts on the ceiling are la belle nature of the heavens, who spread the glory of Apollo, so we are la belle nature of the earth, who speak these divine languages to transmit the glory of the king. Now, here is the allegory of painting. We've already seen a detail of it. Notice that the nymph of painting, the large figure in the center, is a woman, but she's a generic female deity. She makes an abstraction, the idea of painting, concrete. And as such, she doesn't have a lot to say about the place of women in the Kingdom of France. But there is one allegory that uses portraits of real women who were alive in France at the time. The allegory they are in and its rank in the system reveals some arguments that Perrault was making about women in public and private life and the value of their contribution to the kingdom. This painting is the allegory of music. It allows Perrault to explore three topics related to women's place in society: women in the arts and letters, women's education, and of course, the traditional roles of wife and mother. Madame de Maintenon, the second wife of Louis XIV, is portrayed here as the nymph of music herself. The young lute player is the king's illegitimate son, the Duc de Maine. Music was an important part of the education of the king's children, and La Maintenon was their governess. But there is an even more important thematic reason for her presence. Notice that in the image, the nymph holds a lyre decorated with a carving of the sun, an allusion to Louis XIV. La Maintenon is not only the nymph of music, she is also the guardian of the harmony of the royal home and family. The young girl playing the harpsichord is likely Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, and she can be seen as a symbol of females who publicly participate in the arts and adds to the glory of the kingdom. A child prodigy, de la Guerre had come to court as a teenager around 1680. She was known for her skill in playing and composing for the harpsichord, and she is the first French woman to have had one of her operas performed. In fact, you can see an opera in the background on the far left, and you'll see it in the next slide. She pleased the king so much that she was one of a handful of elite musicians who were invited to play alone in his presence. So here you can see the opera. The allegory suggests that women can have influence publicly and politically as well as in the home. De la Guerre was a mother, and La Maintenon was a surrogate mother, even though she never gave birth to her own children. Both women were connected to the court. Moreover, La Maintenon exemplifies the participation of women in literary society. Prior to her marriage to Louis XIV, she had been the wife of the accomplished poet Paul Scarron, and she had had access to the highest levels of Parisian salon society. The image of these women allows Perrault to praise the traditional roles of wife and mother and the virtues of a harmonious family life over which an honnête woman would ideally preside. But he can at the same time make the argument that a woman's participation in the arts and in public life does not have to compete with traditional functions. In fact, motherhood can be enhanced by such participation, as can the harmony of the state. Now, let's look back at the position of the allegory of music to notice how women rank within the ideal kingdom's ecosystem. La Musique is located in the top rank of paintings in the top row among the arts that are closest to the divine. You can see in the image that there is a shadow that falls across the bottom row, and this symbolizes that these art forms, while still divine, they require labor, so they're closer to the earth. And the art forms at the top are mostly creations of the mind, and they're closer to the divine. So of the three in the top row, music is the art form that's closest to the lower register, the closest to earth of those three. And the function of this art form in the ecosystem is to unify earth and heaven. It is a powerful example of La Belle Nature because, as Perrault says, the language of music can move not only the gods and not only human beings, but it can evoke a living response from even the rocks and the other normally insentient parts of nature. It employs harmony that is a creative force able to reconcile natures that are ordinarily opposed. Now, by highlighting Madame de Maintenon and girls' musical accomplishments, Perrault is also foregrounding women's education. Because of the religious tensions in the country between Catholics and Huguenots throughout the century, a girl's ability to read and write had become a matter of state interest. It was thought that the Catholic religion could be spread to future children through their future mothers if girls were taught rudimentary dogmatic positions. The higher education of women became a fashionable topic in the 17th century due to the learning and culture of the hostesses of literary salons, and these social institutions allowed women informal access to culture. In 1686, Madame de Maintenon opened a school in response to these two trends, really. It was a school for impoverished noble girls at Saint-Cyr, the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis. The school's patron was Louis XIV himself. The Mercure Galant reported that the school rewarded nobles for their service by removing the cost of educating daughters so that the families could better serve His Majesty by allocating resources for the education of their sons. So, is Perrault advocating the Saint-Cyr system for girls' education? Maybe, but maybe not. For one thing, theater was seen as a corrupting influence on the girls for the school. It is significant that Perrault places portraits of human women in an allegory alongside a scene from an opera. Apparently, he does not agree that theater will corrupt female morals. He was also close to his grandniece, Marie-Jeanne Lheritier, a protégée of Salonière, Mademoiselle de Scudéry. Lheritier endorsed the equal education of women and men and the total equality of the sexes. She was frequently around Perrault's own daughter during her former years, serving as a surrogate mother, and she testified to the good education Perrault gave to all of his children. For these reasons, I think it's best to view Madame de Maintenon's presence in Perrault's cabinet as a conservative public statement in favor of women's education, rather than as a wholesale endorsement of Madame de Maintenon's system and methods. So what about non-ideal images of women? Did Perrault ever use iconography to admit that women are human beings and have faults? Did he ever represent the battle of the sexes? The answer is yes, he did, and one of the iconographic programs that he designed is a great example. Our next stop will be Perrault's plan for a section of the Gardens of Versailles that was known as the Labyrinth. Midway through his public career, Perrault had the opportunity to work with iconography based on fables. The gardens at Versailles were being expanded, and an irregular section, a labyrinth or maze, was going to be created. The labyrinth would be decorated with 39 fountains based upon themes from Aesop's fables. Perrault was exercising the skills from the art of the device, only now it was applied to 3 dimensions. The image, what would normally be a 2-dimensional image for a device, was here a 3-dimensional sculpture, a fountain. and a poem attached to the fountain to explain it took the place of the inscription that a device would have. A poet was needed for this garden to provide madrigals for each of the fountains and to give an overarching literary theme to the retellings so that visitors to the garden would gain intellectual pleasure from the journey through the maze. Louis XIV passed over both Perrault and Jean de La Fontaine for the appointment. The commission went to Benserade in the end, but Perrault published his own version because he resented this. And he gave a copy of his version to Alexandre Bontemps to give to visitors of the garden. Bontemps was the keeper of the park at Versailles, and he was the first valet of the king's bedchamber. The labyrinth was an immersive physical experience. Visitors engaged their minds, performed as actors in the drama set up by the labyrinth, and engaged their senses. The themes concerning courtship, men, women, and love would emerge organically from the conversation held by four different things: the statues, the sound of the water, the text of the poet, and the living guests following the path and grasping the overarching themes and sub-themes of the garden. Perrault wanted to overlay the garden with a theme of romantic love. The statues at the entrance represent Cupid holding a ball of twine and Aesop. Perrault's idea was that these figures would symbolize love helping you find a way through the labyrinth of courtship, where you would meet many unworthy suitors, and then having wisdom to teach you discernment along the way with the fables. The stops on the path contain Perrault's poetic retellings of Aesop's fables for the labyrinth fountain statues. And here is one of his adaptations placed beside his rival poet Benserade's. Notice that Perrault adds a moral that relates to courtship. So here's Perrault's. A cat hung himself by the leg and played dead, and he caught several rats. Another time he covered himself in flour. An old rat said to him, "If you were even a sack of flour, I wouldn't go near you." And here's the moral. Often the safest thing to do is to retreat. The cat is a cat, a flirt is a flirt. In this case, Perrault is warning men that you cannot change the nature of a flirt who breaks hearts for sport. And lest we be really angry at Perrault for using a cat's nature to represent women, let us remind ourselves that Puss in Boots, a mentor of highly questionable ethics, shows up as a male character in the fairy tale. Now, I don't have time to go through all of the 39 stories individually. I did that in my dissertation and created a table with lots of evidence to compare. How did Perrault hold up standards for women and men? How did he show their faults? Are men's and women's faults different from each other, or does he have a double standard? What's the conclusion? And so what I've done today is summarize for you my findings. And if you look at the table and study it for a moment, you can ask how similar or different these good qualities are. This table gives you what you should aim for. Men, if you want to be successful in love, be like this. Women, be like this if you want to win the heart of a man. So Perrault's goal was to advise both men and women how to find true love and avoid common pitfalls of courtship. And so it is kind of a battle of the sexes because both sexes are warned against the dangerous traits of the other. But as I think you can see, he doesn't really pit them against each other. These lists are actually quite similar. Thoughtfulness and gentleness in speech for the men is quite similar to tact and kindness for the women. They both need to maintain proper self-love. They both need to develop discernment and wisdom, for example. And the same thing is true for the bad qualities. Even though there are some differences, an insincere man might be a very similar thing to a flirt, or a treacherous man might be a very similar thing to a manipulative woman. So they're bad qualities. It's not like men are worse than women, women are better than men. It's not really like that. So here are some takeaways. Good and bad qualities can be accessed by both men and women in this program. Overall, the collection demonstrates more similarities between men and women and more equality between them in their basic humanity than it shows differences. Certain behaviors are marked by gender division. For example, an overarching assumption is that men will be the pursuers and women will be the pursued. But Perrault does not uphold an ideal of activity for men and passivity for women. Though playing the part of the pursued, the women described in the program are not passive. When exercising their part in positive ways, for example, they are discerning between good and bad men, they are encouraging the good ones, and they are dismissing the unworthy. Additionally, the bad traits most marked by gender are coquetry or flirting on the one hand and brutality on the other, a fact which suggests to me that men and women can both behave well or badly, but the way they do it can be gendered. Let's talk for a moment about the medium of the fountain water. Here, water, which from antiquity had been coded female, is the element chosen to make the sound of the statue's voices. Why was it so important to give the animals a voice, and how is the voice connected to the value of women? Women had actually contributed greatly to the perfection and prestige of the French language through the phenomenon of preciosité. The précieuses, women of means and leisure, held salons at their grand hotels and gathered people of literary and musical talent around them. The spoken word, elegantly pronounced and meaningfully emphasized, was the locus of eloquence at these gatherings. A poem or a song was the setting for the beautiful voice, which was seen as uniquely suited to translate the discourse of the soul and to truly reveal its beauty. By the time Perrault began working for Colbert in 1662, people thought the French language could compete with the great languages of antiquity as a medium for the arts. Here, the water, a deeply feminine element, pays homage to women as the source of eloquence and of the very best French. Because France had a central monarchy, the French spoken by the monarch was capable of being the standard against which all the different dialects of the kingdom could be measured and in which all of them were united. Women, whose language was unspoiled by Latin or Greek influence, were seen as the source of the best French. Their spontaneous and graceful manner of speaking was a model for their children and even for the king himself. For example, in 1667, Louis de Labarreur argued that French, rather than Latin, should be the linguistic foundation of the Dauphin's education. In Les Avantages de la langue française sur la langue latine, Le Labarreur argues that the French language is the ideal nursemaid to reason. The mother tongue trains the child student's reason for the time of maturity when life experience will refine his character. Le Labarreur's reasoning was, quote, the language of the kingdom, as opposed to pagan languages, was the vehicle and mirror of divine revelation, unquote. With his analogy linking divinity, motherhood, and childhood, Le Labarreur links women and language to the divine and to the origin of the king's speech. So let's return to the princess and the fairy tales and link them to what we know about how Perrault uses iconography. What more can we find out? First, what does this portrait say about her? For this device, the red rose with thorns is almost certainly an allusion to Venus, goddess of beauty. So it is a compliment to the princess. That the princess is the rose, the child of Venus, is supported by the motto's allusion to beauty. The Latin and French mean something very similar. They mean beauty born crowned versus I am beautiful and born to be crowned. Also, this was a common association of the rose symbol. For example, the same symbol appears in a manuscript from the early Précieuses salons that was a famous gift of love, the rose in the Guirlande de Julie. The accompanying poem links the thorns and the red rose with Venus, who, according to legend, pricked her foot on the thorns of the rose and turned the flower red with her blood. With this allusion, the speaker styles himself as a son of the goddess of love herself. The rose also shows the princess's lineage. Perrault had already used the image for a device he composed for Louis XIV. Here, the princess is not only the child of Venus, but also the child of France, sharing the king's blood. The inscription alludes to both her beauty and her royalty. But have you noticed that this rose is being used androgynously, even though it takes a feminine pronoun in French? When the image of the rose is assigned to the princess, its gender matches the reference, but it changes sex when used to represent a man. Our question is, could the princess be represented as androgynous like the king was in the Elements Tapestry series? Could she be seen as a person who held the full potentiality of masculine and feminine like the king could? The letter accompanying the device suggests that the princess's character, though she is female, is equal to that of a great hero. The text associates the princess's mind, education, and function with that of a great king, and I'm going to read you an excerpt from it. Mademoiselle, there is some disproportion between the childish simplicity of these tales and the astonishing cluster of lights that nature and education have gathered in you. I am perhaps not as blameworthy as it seems if one considers that nothing marks so much the vast expanse of one's mind as to be able to rise to the greatest things and to lower oneself to the smallest. It is true that these tales give an image of what happens in the lowliest families. But who better to know how people live than the people that heaven intends to lead them? The desire for this knowledge has led heroes and heroes of your race to go to the ends of the kingdom to see for themselves what they thought was necessary for the perfect instruction of the greatest monarchs. The last thing we can observe about the princess's device concerns the two languages she speaks in Latin and French. The French is in the first person, and this is partly because the motto served as the voice for the device. According to theorists of the form, the motto needed to seem as though the referent were speaking in his or her own voice. This meant that if the object, like the rose, if that object took a masculine pronoun, it would be inappropriate to a woman, and the same was true for a man. So if the iconographer wanted to get around that problem and use the image anyway, he could use the first person or a language like Latin. However, in this case, the rose is already feminine, so why does Perrault use both French and Latin? What is he doing there? I believe that Perrault is demonstrating two things: his mastery of the form and the naturally superior taste of women. Latin and French were competing languages when it came to the arts. The party of the ancients in the Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes wanted the Dauphin to be educated using the language of the great classics of antiquity. The party of the moderns, led by Perrault, argued that French was the superior choice for both spiritual and political reasons. This was a very serious disagreement. Guillaume reminds us that the regime of Louis XIV was self-consciously shaped in reference to the age of Augustus and Pericles, a Latin-speaking culture. This had been a brilliant moment for political and military power, as well as for the arts and letters. In 17th century France, the age of Augustus was not only seen as something to imitate, but as something to surpass. In fact, the mythology of the greatness of the arts and letters for the age of Louis presupposes that the French language had reached its point of perfection. So, because language is intrinsically a part of the form of the device, the controversy about language touched it. Perrault's decision to include both languages demonstrates his own mastery of the form because the device communicates just as well in either language. But the equality of the two inscriptions leaves the superiority of one or the other ambiguous. The contest has no winner. Since the letter is addressed to the princess, the suggestion is that the author bows to her superior judgment in this quarrel, and she can choose the inscription that she likes the best. Jacqueline Lichtenstein might agree. She has observed that the final authority for the moderns in terms of art was the infallible taste of women. Indeed, Perrault himself would have thought along these lines. His character of the abbé in Parallèle des Anciennes et des Modernes, his mouthpiece, writes this of women's artistic judgment, quote, "Everyone knows how correct their discernment is in subtle and delicate matters, how sensitive they are to what is clear, lively, natural, and in good taste," end quote. It is perhaps because of his reverence for the taste of women and the unspoiled naturalness of their language that Perrault associates himself with a woman's voice, that of the female teller of stories who stands in as his portrait on the frontispiece of the fairy tales. Thank you for your attention, and I invite any questions you may have.
I don't want to see other questions, but I definitely had some. Among other things, I mean, I am not at all a specialist in this area, but so I was wondering if you could say a little more than you already have about sort of how original these lines of thinking that you have discerned in Perrault were for him, or how, did he really stand out, or how much was it part of a wider culture?
When I was looking at him, it's not like he contributed some really new art theory. Like, he doesn't do that. Even when he's talking about the theory of nature and how the fine arts fit into this sort of metaphorical scheme, even that metaphor is not really original to him. And the great apostle of Honnêteté, the Chevalier de Marais, kind of describes personal self-development in exactly the same terms. So what I would say is that what Perrault is doing is he's selecting elements that trends and elements that were in the culture and saying, these are the ones that I feel I am integrating into my own personal philosophy. And that's what you get with Le Cabinet de Beaux-Arts.
Right. And specifically with regard to the pictures with the mottos, how much is that? How much can you make sort of connections with the contemporary culture of emblems?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the first part of the question.
Oh, when we talk, you said, well, an important part of your talk were the various pictures that each have mottos,
Oh yeah.
some of which are analyzed, and I mean, obviously these. You call them devices, which they are, but these are at the time also related to emblems. And I
Yeah,
was
let me go
wondering
back to this page.
what
Yeah.
the sort of relationships were.
Well, in the 16th century, the word emblem, the word device, they were all kind of like used interchangeably. And by Perrault's
Yes.
time, everybody's starting to differentiate the categories. How is an emblem different from a device? And in this picture that I brought up, on the far left, this is a device, and this is the smallest, is like the smallest form. And in fact, sometimes the words would just appear without the image, but they were meant to be a unit. And then here, this one, the second one over, this picture was the same device, but it was put into an emblem form. And so in that case, it was longer. It had a long explanation. And it was more of like a moral allegory. So in this case, it had an inscription plus a short poem that elucidated the inscription even more, and a prose explanation. And it was painted to like all of the devices that were on those tapestries were separated from the tapestries and painted in miniature by Jacques Bailly and put into a manuscript called Devises pour les tapisseries du roi, and it was meant for the leisure hours of the king. And it was like a moral type of entertainment for his leisure hours. And then later, Perrault and Félibien oversaw several different publications of these devices, so Perrault became quite famous for them.
Right. Yes. Well, my question was, of course, also about again the sort of the element of originality, as to how far do some of the meanings that Perrault assigned to various image elements correspond to existing emblem traditions, and then how far are they completely novel?
I don't think that they were really novel.
Mm,
The real novelty for Perrault was in taking something existing and putting a fresh slant on something.
mhm.
And he was doing this in the company of the Petite Académie. So this was like his creative working group, and they would have like given him feedback on it. And they were all searching through the history of royal photographic history, different ways that other rulers had used emblems, and they were self-consciously trying to relate what they were giving to Louis to other rulers, to his parents, to his ancestors, etc. So I don't think that he wanted to be original. He wanted to kind of draw from what was already there.
I was also wondering, both with the cabinet and the garden design with the statues, as to how far that made use of the sort of, you could say, the idea of the memory palace, basically making particular concepts specifically memorable through a particular organization and visualization.
Oh, I had not thought of that question, but you're right that it probably would, because it would have involved the whole body. Because you're walking through the garden and you're an actor in the whole
Yes.
drama that's set up. Um, and then the way that Perrault published the cabinet, he had the book engraved first.
Hmm.
And so it was supposed to be kind of like a leisure entertainment. And so you would read it, and as you were reading through it, your eye would become more and more educated. And the pictures started to show more than the explanations revealed. So the pictures became more and more eloquent, and something emerged as you meditated on it. So I think you're right that it would. I just hadn't thought about it from that angle.
Well, it seemed with the cabinet that it was very much a space that you were meant to sort of virtually move through and then
Yes.
observe various elements in different places.
Hmm.
And the garden does that in a physical sense.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, and I don't see any, then I can only thank you again for what has been a most enlightening and entertaining presentation.